you feel that? Because
I'm actually going to get the assignment up today.
I like.
Yay, I keep saying that that's going to be the case. I'll have it by tomorrow. I'll have it by tomorrow. The wonderful thing is tomorrow never arrives.
What about feedback on the first assignment, the EPA class?
That's a good question. I'll make sure that Stephen is on that.
Stephen's grades?
He is.
We'll just need to be nice and helpful.
Yeah. Yeah, that would be ideal. So do note that the goal of these assignments is not to be particularly harsh or strict. As long as you're putting effort into your assignments, assume things are going well. My goal is not to fail people in this class. It's an elective. I have a very different approach to electives than I do to required courses. I challenge people a lot in my required courses. Electives should be about learning, having fun, and not throwing a bunch of useless work at you that no one wants to do. The work that I assign should be fun, should be revealing in some capacity. If that's not the case, these assignments will get dry by the end of the quarter. But I get a lot out of them, reading them, understanding how you learn, how you engage with this material. So the assignment for Sunday is exactly the same, just over the next 3 chapters, and that will be the case for every single assignment. Just assume that every week there is a new assignment, even if it's not quite posted yet. I'll try to be better than I was this week about getting that, but it has the exact same grading philosophy. They're literally copies of each other, just over the next 3 chapters, the next 3 chapters, the next 3 chapters for the first 8 weeks. Any questions before we dive into the dynamic layer in more detail?
What are you posting the next assignment?
Should be as soon as I get back to my office. Of course, I say that should be because usually in the trek between the classroom and my office, about 5 new things come up that get added to the stack. So as soon as I get to it, as soon as I get back to my office, should be basically. I say that every time. Other questions or concerns? There was an announcement posted to Canvas, if you didn't see it, about the book files and places to get the book files. That is in the preface of the book. But I think a lot of people turned in the first assignment without knowing where to find those book files. So now there's a link in Canvas you can follow to get those book files. Yeah.
You have to do the book files because I just pointed something else.
Yeah, honestly, whatever is most meaningful to you and you get the most out of, I will not punish people for not following immediately or exactly, as long as there's value to it. As long as I see the value that you are adding to it and that it is useful to you. That's what I care about.
You have all inclusive textbooks in the university or in your textbook section.
There you go. Good to know. Haven't done this with a Canvas book before. But I decided, why not? People wanted to use it. All right, last time we introduced the dynamic layer, which is what happens when the game starts being played. It goes from the idea of a game to the actual play that emerges from it. So it's worth talking about this concept that we call emergence. As designers, we design simple rules, and players interpret those rules in ways that lead to complex behavior. In addition, those rules have complex implications with regards to the objectives that are in the game. This could be a game-defined objective or a player-defined objective. However, the player is trying to play the game, interpretation of those rules and what you can do within those rules, even if the rules are simple, it leads to complex behavior, complex interactions within the game. Likewise, as we saw as we were playing around with snakes and ladders, small changes to rules can have very large changes to how players interact with the game. It's worth thinking about exactly what you allow the player to do and prevent the player from doing. A lot of those small changes, large effects on your game. As Chris Swain, one of the people from the very first day with definitions, change a number and you change the game. Every single number can be changed, and each one of those changes has some implication to the outcome of the game, to how the game is played. So things like unexpected dynamic mechanics emerging from inscribed mechanical rules.
Like Skyrim, like water by flying.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, bugs can do that too, which is kind of fun. But it is the designer's responsibility to know how players could interpret the rules, what actions the players could take, and the effects that that will have on the game. You're not just creating rules for how you intend the game to be played, you're creating rules that players will interpret however they're going to interpret it. You're creating they're creating the possibility space for the game. And you get information about this through playtesting, either yourself or getting a wider audience of playtesters who are not designers by nature, who might have very different approaches to your game world than you do or your development team does. So diving back into the tetrad at this layer, dynamic mechanics can be broken down into procedure. What actions do players actually take while they are playing your game? These are not the actions that are prescribed by the rules, but the actions that are actually being taken by the players in real time. What's possible for this is based on those rules, but what actually happens is based on the player within the confines of those rules. There's the concept of meaningful play. Are the actual games that are being played discerned and integrated together? Do people have a meaningful and gameful approach to the games? There's strategy. What actions do players select as they attempt to achieve their goals? Not just the actions that are taken, but when you start looking at sets of actions rather than individual actions, you start to get a sequence of actions, and you start being able to apply the meaning of those sequence of actions with respect to objectives or outcomes. There are house rules where players attempt to modify the rules. This happens a lot in board games, but can also happen with mods in video games. The mods will be part of the cultural layer, but a mod can change how the game is played. So there's a bit of feedback back into the dynamic layer if you change the rules of the game in some capacity. Then there's player intent. Players will be playing the game for different reasons, so it stands to reason that they would have different goals or desired outcomes from the game. You can imagine that in a competitive setting, one player is playing the game to make everyone around them miserable, and another player is playing the game to win. They're going to have very different decision trees with regards to how they approach the game and the actions that they take, the strategies that they employ to achieve their objectives or their goals. Then finally, there's the outcome, which on a game-by-game basis is how the game ends. What was the result of playing the game? Sometimes when you play the game, a player will win, or the players will win, or there will be a game over, or there will be however it is that the game ends. Based on the actual actions that were taken by the players, that defines or dictates the outcome that is achieved from the game.
Does the game necessarily have to happen?
There can be incremental outcomes versus final outcomes. So in D&D, when you end an encounter, that is an outcome. And the strategies that players employ in order to defeat the enemies they're currently facing, you could map those to the associated outcome of an individual battle, even though that's not the end of the campaign.
So the game doesn't explicitly have to end in order for this to be accomplished.
Right. So it could be the end of a game. It could also be the end of an incremental end to an ongoing process. So in more detail, procedures. The actual inscribed rules are the developer's intent. Procedures are the actions taken by the players. I've already talked about most of these, so I'll skim through them a little bit faster. Some examples are pass and go and collecting $200. in Monopoly. That's inscribed as a rule, but when it happens, then it is dynamic. Because it could be that you land on some square that lets you pass go and not collect. Maybe you go straight to jail. You've passed go and haven't collected $200. You've skirted around this. And dynamically, that changes how the game feels to play, because what would have been inscribed, you've now circumvented. We talked about bluffing in poker. It's not described in the rules of the game, but it's become a dynamic outcome from playing because it leads to more frequently winning if you can hide information from your opponent or your opponents. For meaningful play, the actions that are both discernible and integrated, the actions that are taken that are within the game, where the player knows that they are taking that action, discernible. The game reacts to their action. An example of this is when I push a button to an elevator, the button lights up. You can imagine being in a three-dimensional virtual space and pressing a button. And if your sound is muted, you have no idea whether the game registered whether the elevator is on the way or not. If the button lights up, then there's a visual representation. If you press the button and there's a click, if you press the button and you can hear something mechanical operating as the elevator is moving towards your location, all of those communicate to the user that their action was registered by the game. Integrated player knows their action is affecting the overall outcome of the game. They're not just making decisions to make decisions, they're making decisions to advance their objectives and reach their desired outcome. Because I push the call button, I know that the elevator will come to this floor. How does the game communicate that back to the player so that they feel like their decisions are integrated into, I need to get from this floor to the desired floor. I need to know that the game is respecting my desire to change the floor that I am on. If the actions the player takes do not appear to be meaningful, then players can very quickly lose interest. It feels like you're asking me to make a decision, but the decision doesn't matter. Imagine making the decision to attend class or not attend class. If I tell you from today, everyone's getting an A. It's not a meaningful decision anymore, unless you want to get something out of the class. But it takes away from the intended outcome or what helps you to engage with the game. Strategy, anything players do to achieve their goals. The goal doesn't have to be winning the game. Playing with a small child, the goal may be for the child to have fun rather than for yourself to have fun. As an example of a strategy that could emerge from a game that is not based on your overall self-interest. There's the concept of an optimal strategy, where games that are simple, a certain strategy might just be Pareto dominant. There is a way to ensure that if you can win the game, you will win the game. And at any point, there's no better decision to make. An example of this is tic-tac-toe. So simple, we've taught chickens to play it optimally. And it's simple enough to find an optimal procedure for that the game is not interesting. However, especially in video games, most are complex enough not to have an optimal strategy. Or if there is an optimal strategy, it's so well hidden behind decisions that players can't stumble upon it easily. So from a designer's perspective, we want to design so that players can strategize, because this is what creates interesting decisions within games. So first and foremost, you want to provide multiple ways for the player to win. This makes sense. If there are multiple possible outcomes, then you've already created a level of dimensionality where players have to figure out how close am I to each of these different ways of winning the game. Then you create relationships between the possible ways of winning, such that if you're moving toward one, you're also moving toward another, but farther away from a third. And that creates a decision of, is it worth moving farther away from the third in order to get closer to the first and second? That creates an interesting decision. Yeah.
The game, Seven Wonders Duel,
Mm-hmm.
that's like a master lessons.
Yeah. Yeah, there are a lot of games. You can think about the games that have really made you make interesting decisions as you play them as a as something that's good. So some should be complementary, others should be mutually exclusive. Choose one or the other, or choose some in parallel where it helps you with some and hinders you with some others. Strategy is important in just about every game in some capacity. Even if it doesn't have to be involved. It doesn't have to be complex or involve strategy, but players should be making decisions. And those decisions should have meaning. House rules, small changes to the inscribed rules, often important card games, could be intentional or unintentional if the rules are ambiguous or not particularly clear, or don't define all of the associated needed rules. Then players will interpret and to play the game the way that they think makes the most sense, or should be the most fun, or should be the most fair. So if you do not make your inscribed rules clear, then players interpret the rules the way that they want to. Players can get experience with game design from making house rules, which is exactly what we did on the first week of class. We made some house week or some house rules for Snakes and Ladders.
There's another one, the stacking of +4s. That's not technically a rule,
Yeah, that is not technically a rule.
but I think we all agree, that's a bullshit rule.
Something about Uno too. There's actually a scoring system, and it's not based on who
Yeah,
just who that. It's not based on it's not a race. It's actually just whoever gets the most points out of it.
Yeah, it's like,
Did you know
points
that?
determined, but like when you win, I think it's like all the cards your opponents have, you can tally that up to a score.
yeah, gives you a reason to win early. Player intent, in general, dynamic experience shaped by the intents of players who are playing your game. We can dive into things like games that map to Bartle's player types. We'll go into a unit on player types eventually, where we talk about the kinds of players who play games. But in general, Bartle's types are the achiever. In general, they want the highest score in the game. They want to dominate the game. The explorer wants to understand the game by finding hidden places or hidden objects. The socializer, playing the game with friends, wants to understand the other players and interact with them. And the killer wants to provoke the other players and dominate the other players. So we have two dimensions, understanding and dominating. And then two other dimensions, the players and the game. This was a very old sense of player typology that there's been a ton of work that's been done on this since. But this is the very first basic attempt at creating player types. And there are also people you don't want in your game at all. Cheaters and spoil sports. Cheaters who aren't going to adhere to the rules, and spoil sports who get enjoyment out of other people's lack of enjoyment. This is why League of Legends is not a game.
I think we need to calendar for how many times we read.
This is the next drinking game. Just watch your lecture.
Yeah, there you go.
League of Legends.
It never gets old.
Even we keep drinking that much.
Sure. Layers of outcomes. We can have immediate outcomes. Whenever an action leads to an immediate result, that is the outcome of that action. There is a quest outcome. What happens when you complete or fail a quest? Can do things like give you a chance to resolve a sub-story, a side story, a small piece of the narrative, give that some conclusion. There's cumulative outcome, which is the result from working toward an outcome or a goal over a long period of time. How did that resolve? So you gather experience points to eventually level up. That is a cumulative outcome from actions that are taken that gain you experience points. There's a final outcome, the outcome that ends the game. And in video games, unlike in real life, death is not the final outcome most frequently. And of course, some games lack a final outcome in general, and you decide to end the game when you want to be done with the game. Any questions on anything so far? On to aesthetics. Aesthetics that emerge when playing the game. A lot of this is anything that is generated on the fly. Two main categories. We have procedural aesthetics. Any programming that is generated while running. So things like procedural terrain, procedural outcomes, procedural difficulty. We have environmental aesthetics. So aesthetics of the environment. How does the environment look, feel, etc. as it's being generated? For procedural aesthetics, how technology combines with the inscribed aesthetics. So procedural music, anything where you write an algorithm that generates the music based on what the player is doing. It wasn't inscribed, you didn't compose this music, but you compose the algorithm that generates the music. So what the player experiences in real time is based on how they're engaging with the game. So it's dynamic. We can horizontally resequence. That way we inscribe different sections of music and select which one to play dynamically based on the player's experience. We could vertically reorchestrate. Tracks of music are enabled or disabled to lend various voices to the music and change the feel. So this is where you would compose a 10-minute clip and there would be different instruments as part of it, and you enable or disable the instruments based on how intense you want it to feel or laid back you want it to feel. That's more vertical rather than horizontal. And then there's completely procedural composition that is composed on the fly based on the game situation. So that's pretty cool, the fact that there are 3 different ways to procedurally generate, with different levels of inscribed and different dimensions of inscribed composition. Some visual examples, particle systems. Oftentimes the exact particle that is seen is based on some randomization. So that can lead to large explosions having large particles that go off in different directions, etc. That is dynamically generated based on how the player is playing the game. Particle animation. Aesthetics related to the environment. The actual environment that you're playing in certainly affects the experience. Things like the brightness of the environment versus the screen. If you play with a very dark setting versus a very light setting, the game may feel completely differently. If it's a horror game or if it's a game that requires you to notice movement immediately, exactly how dark the screen is, how much the screen has, what the contrast of the screen is. The resolution of the screen, playing the same game at a higher resolution or a lower resolution can change the dynamic feel of the game. There's the entire auditory play environment. So how noisy is your environment? What noises are playing within your environment? If the players play at different volumes, that dynamically changes how the game feels. If they mute the game, that can change how the game feels. Things you might want to consider when designing games for players, things like color blindness, especially red-green color blindness, most common. Any design that might trigger epilepsy or migraines in your players. Things that you should probably warn players about at the beginning of your game if it's something that you intentionally put into your design. There's nothing against including it. It's just something that if your players struggle with these, you should probably let them know before your game does something to them. Dynamic narrative. How is the game story changing as it's being played? Again, 2 major types. Interactive fiction. Inscribed story that adapts based on the choices the player makes. And an emergent narrative. how the player defines what has happened to them as the game has been played. An example of this is I had a roommate in college and we would play a lot of Saints Row 2 together. And no matter how I played the game, I would end up with a fairly boring experience. But as soon as I handed the controller over to my roommate, he would get in the weirdest situations that were so utterly ridiculous, they were fun and created their own story. Remember that time in this game when and because of how the lack of preparation for anything that he did just led to absolutely ridiculous outcomes that I could not reproduce myself. How we played the game differently led to a completely different experience and an ability to tell stories about the game. Dynamic technology, runtime behavior of the technology itself. So paper technologies, what are the expected, the theoretical probabilities of things, the theoretical behavior of the rules versus the actual play in a particular instance of the game. Deviations from expectations. In a certain game situation, a 6 is rarely rolled from many 2d6 rolls, even though probability states it should be the outcome 5 out of 36 times. But you can imagine that you have 40 rolls in a row where we don't get a 2d6 with an outcome of a 6. Strange. And if a 6 is the measure of success, you must roll a 6 in order to get something. You can imagine that 40 consecutive failures of something with probability 5 out of 36, not particularly likely and may drastically change the experience of the game. In digital technologies, anything the code execution does, so can include things like strategies developed by the technology, any AI, execution of game code, underlying execution of non-game code, so how your operating system or other hardware interacts with the actual game as it's being played. You have a very different experience playing a graphically demanding game on older hardware than on newer hardware. That difference appears in the dynamic layer. Any last questions on the dynamic layer as a whole? We'll spend the least time on the cultural layer. I'm trying to go through this a little bit faster just because I know it's a little repetitive at this point. But beyond play, how do games affect culture at a larger level? So what happens after we finish playing the game? Does it affect the players? Does it affect society? Just in general, how have games affected your life? How have you changed as a person due to your experiences with games? How have you affected or changed games? I can give examples of myself posting on message boards, the developers seeing this and making changes. If anyone knows or has heard of Out of the Park Baseball, I made a change to that game that was taken seriously by the developers. I posted that in simulations, they had the ability to watch a recap of the game that was being played, like it was a highlight. And unfortunately, there was no way to hide the score of the game ahead of time, so I could see the end result of the game before watching the highlight reel from that game. So they added the ability to hide all scores so that you can see the highlights like you are watching, and having the outcome of the game is not known and it's much faster than watching actually every play of the game. So that was cool. But you can affect games similarly by having feedback. So that exists within the cultural layer, everything that affects the game beyond its play itself. So the intersection of the community of players, of the game, and society. The effect of game on society and society on a game. Players certainly have more agency than developers. The developers need to be aware of the cultural implications of their work, and the players don't necessarily have to worry about that so much. How you talk about a game does not have to adhere to the same levels of standards that developers have when they are creating their game. You don't sue the players of your game, you sue the developers of the game. We have a bit less distinction between the tetrad at this level, but let's attempt to do the best that we can. Mechanics. When players take over ownership of the mechanics, this appears in things like mods. Some examples were creating Defense of the Ancients from Warcraft 3.
Is that what those stand for?
Yeah.
We're not gonna do that.
Yep. Skyrim's creation kit, creating new characters and quests in Skyrim, etc. Just some examples. Any custom game levels. So this is a very cultural mechanic. You can create a level editor and allow people to create levels for your game. Common in FPS games. There are entire games that the developers basically create a sandbox. They don't specify too much and say now the players create the experience within that game. So Little Big Planet had a couple of ship levels very early on, and the entire game was levels that the community created. That was the game. Creating levels and playing levels that other people have created. Minecraft fits in that pretty darn well as well. So differs from house rules here in mechanics. We're significantly altering the inscribed rules rather than interpreting the rules or filling in blanks. It's now we are altering them for that purpose. We're doing that intentionally, and not just necessarily for ourselves, but to share our experience of the game with the rest of our culture. We publish the rule changes that we make so that other people can utilize them as well. So some examples of cultural mechanics, things like losing friends over board games, or by playing League of Legends. Everyone take a shot. The concept of being more aware of your surroundings after you play an FPS, just that's psychological. When you're engaged in, you're creating fight or flight in yourself by engaging in a game that requires very fast reflex. As soon as you transition abruptly from playing the game to real life, so that twitchy instinct follows you around for a while because your body is still primed for fight or flight. Yeah.
I've also seen some studies that say like surgeons who play video games are more accurate with their surgery tools as they're more used to motor reflexes.
Yep.
So that's also probably possible.
Yeah. What you do for a living can affect your performance in a game, and you can train yourself in a game for performance in real life. How conspicuous you are after playing a stealth game. Do you start sneaking around in real life, thinking about and seeing, oh, that's good cover. Oh. Wonder if I peek around this corner, if they're gonna notice that I'm here. Fun ways to climb buildings after playing Assassin's Creed. Drive around, wonder if I could scale that building. It primes your brain to think a little bit differently, but it starts to affect you in real life. So that belongs in the cultural layer. You start thinking and bringing the game's mechanics into your interactions in real life. Yeah.
This is like kind of similar, but I used to skate a lot, like skateboard a lot. And
Yeah.
to this day, I look at like ledges and like stairs and stuff, and it's like an automatic like scoping out.
Yeah.
Like what would be usable.
Yeah.
So I guess it's kind of simple.
Yeah. Especially when you can do something fantastical in a game, you start thinking about, wow, if this were the game world, what could I do in this game world? Yeah, absolutely.
Or you just buy a sword on the internet and see if you're as good at using it as
Oh, there's no clipping in this reality. Darn.
I remember hearing something with like a game called The Witness, where it's like it's basically just a
Puzzle game.
yeah, it's like 500 puzzles
Yeah.
to a line thing, where it's like apparently a lot of people had like a weird thing where after they're done with the game, they started seeing a lot of things in like real world where it's like there's just a circle connected to a line that goes
Yeah.
somewhere. With
Yeah.
that weird feeling.
Yeah, you start making associations. Cultural aesthetics, community players make their own art. This can be their own game art. They can mod in separate art for the game. Fan art, art outside of the game that uses the game as inspiration. Covers gameplay as well. So something like the elegant play of a highly skilled player. You can imagine watching a streamer who streams this game full time. And you don't have time to play this game 24/7, but you can appreciate how skilled they are at the art of playing the game effectively because of the amount of practice that they have. So you can see now designers as being relatively similar to instrument crafters or musicians who create compositions that other people require skill in order to master that composition. The elegant play of a game is very similar. Creates a marketable skill of streaming your skill of the game. I still don't know why people pay for that. Cultural narrative, any fan fiction, any stories that are written about a game or a game world outside of the game itself. Narrative game mods, your own stories within a game. Some examples of this. Changing the rules of The Legend of Zelda the Wind Waker to refer to Link as she, so that his daughter could get a sense of female empowerment from a protagonist. Adding your own quests and stories to Fallout 3 or Skyrim. You can use a game engine to tell your own story. If anyone remembers Red vs. Blue, a comedy series shot inside Halo, from completely within that game engine, within the game itself. So that created a cultural narrative out of a game. Yeah, so also stories told by other people, news media about games and gameplay. So a narrative that is out there, video game addiction playing a role in school shootings. The link there or the lack of link there is something that is a discussion outside of the scope of games, but it fits in the cultural narrative layer because it attempts to put a narrative on how gameplay affects real life. We've had some conclusions from that, but still certainly needs to be studied in more detail.
I hate to inform you, but there will come a day when you have to change Red versus Blue shot inside Halo to Skibidi Toilet shot inside the Valve engine. There's gonna come a day.
Yeah.
It's that movie that
I don't know if I'm ever willing to refer to that in a class.
You're gonna talk about Red versus Blueness, nobody's gonna do it.
Yeah.
They're
Yeah.
colored.
You old person, get with the times. Use real memes that we can identify with. There's also the story of how a woman published a story about how Journey helped her dying father come to terms with his impending death. So it can be pretty powerful as well. So a couple discussion points, because I've been talking at you for a long time. It's worth having a little bit of back and forth. So how can designers affect the stories that are told about their games? Obviously, we're stepping into the role of a designer now. So if we're going to be aware of the cultural layer, how can we design for that cultural layer? Any thoughts on that? Yeah.
Starting off from like the last example, if you tell like an impactful story in your game, it can kind of lead into developing the culture of people talk about your game, like helping them get through those hard times, especially if you're like telling this your own story from heart.
Sure.
You know, there
Can train empathy as well.
Yeah.
If you show two individuals having a heart to heart and then being supportive of each other, that can become a way that people can understand interacting with each other outside of the scope of that game. So that starts to have a cultural effect on that. And if people ask why, you would say, oh, it's this game that I played. It was really moving and meaningful.
On that same note, games can or force the player to come up with their own opinions of or their own interpretations of the story in the game, and this can lead to debates outside of the game.
Yeah, if you leave a story, kind of how a good book, an English class might say, what is the author's intent? But it doesn't really matter what the author intended. It matters the different ways that you can interpret the events that happened to create your own meeting out of those events. If you can prescribe those events such that there is some ambiguity in how it is taken, then it can create discussion around the game and the events that took place. I like that.
Open-ended dynamics kind of lend themselves to telling stories about games, I feel like. So like, if there's many different ways to, like, think about how open-ended the dynamics, like something like Grand Theft Auto is. Where you can be chased by the cops, you can run up this civilian, the world's a really living and breathing place. And constantly you'll hear stories about, yeah, there was a time when I was Grand Theft Auto and I was doing this particular crazy thing, and then this crazy thing happens. It's just like, yeah, dynamics lend themselves to being stories.
Yeah. Whenever there are lots of choices and very open-ended games with lots you can do, there is always a choice to make.
Feeling like it might be unique, something that you have to say about it.
There's like a whole part of YouTube where people do like challenge runs of video games.
Yeah. Yeah.
Put like like shackles on themselves to make the games harder.
Yeah, so you can add mechanics that are difficult. Maybe it's easy to win, but difficult to master. And that can create a subculture of optimizing the play of your game. And that can be something that you design for. Stories that are told by Dark Souls have lasted for years because of the challenge of FromSoft games.
That's the Super Mario 64 speed runs where like, the guy's blindfolded or like climbing the hero controlling.
Yeah.
I was gonna say any kind of game where the co-op element I think is great because the players are helping each other and they remember stories. Like again in Dark Souls, it's like you summon your friend and you fight a boss.
Yeah.
It's a cool moment.
Yeah. If you're not requiring them to be with you all the time, although you can go that route, and games like It Takes Two, where you have two players who are playing the entire game together, can create a bonding experience between people because of what you overcame in a game setting, and that can go far beyond just the gameplay itself and can have lasting effects on your relationship with that person.
I think It Takes Whoever caused a divorce. I bet you did.
Be fun to be able to come up with those stats to be able to measure that. Huh?
And I think something that's like I don't know if this is on top of like stuff with like roguelikes, where it's like you get this one broken build or something like that. No, I kind of wonder if like it was a very magical moment paying some guy playing Balatra and realize that you can get Nan infinite.
Yeah, just creating a large enough scope of mechanics that finding optimal paths through it is a real challenge and takes a long time. That can create stories and create a community of interest as well.
I think I find that like a lot of like open world games and sandbox games have a super active community hub page on Steam.
Yeah.
So looking at how active people are on the community hub in Steam for particular games might be like a good insight into this.
Yeah. Very good points. All right. Moving on to actually designing games. We've talked about analyzing games, but we need to start talking about the actual process of making games. What is that like? What are the stages? How do we go from concept to creation?
Well, you need to brainstorm.
We definitely need to brainstorm. In fact, we're going to have a brainstorming task that we'll be doing very quickly here. So first step, analysis. Chris Wayne says game design is 1% inspiration and 99% iteration. So we need to understand where we are and what we need to accomplish within an analysis phase. We need to think about what resources do we have? How much time do we have? The number one killer of small, short projects in part 2 of this class that we'll be making, small, short projects, is overscoping. It's wanting to do way too much and then not having the time and resources to be able to turn that vision into something that is playable. So what we should do instead is prototype and layer. So you're going to, very much like in a software engineering class, you're going to be iterating in extremely rapid pace sprints, where the goal should be going through this process and having something that is almost playable on a daily basis, basically a daily build that you eventually layer out like an onion, where you add a small feature, small feature, small feature on the edges of the game. And at any particular point in time, you could stop and have the best product that you've had so far. So you continue to add features as you have time, but you want to design for something that is fun from the very beginning, even with just its base components. There's an idea there. And then as you add more to it, it gets better and better. It's not something that requires 12 moving parts. And if you're missing one of those 12 moving parts, there's a glaring hole in the game. So that's step one. Step two, going into design. From that analysis, we're going to design a solution. First step of design is brainstorming, ends with a plan for how we're going to implement what was brainstormed. From there, we move into implementation. Execute your plan. That should end with a working game prototype. So shortest path to something that is playable and testable, because a lot of the change in a game itself comes from playing and testing your ideas. It's not enough to just finish implementing your idea. A lot of times there is iteration that's needed just from the data that you gather from engaging with your creation. And finally, we move into testing, because everything needs to be tested, especially in games. So actually sit down and play your game, have other people sit down and play your game, and figure out how people react to the implementation of your ideas. You can then focus and start to design your next iteration based on addressing the feedback from yourself or other people who are playing your game. Then you iterate on this, analyze the results of the testing, modify your design, implement the modifications, and retest. And now it is just a cycle of however much time and resource you have, iterating this process until you are happy enough to ship. So as before, we're going to go into a bit more detail about each of these. What should you be thinking about in detail at each of these steps? But this is the bird's eye view of each of those steps. This should sound relatively familiar to a software engineering style, except that it's a bit different. Rather than something that is a repeated waterfall process or something that is agile in nature, although we will talk about how to incorporate agile into game design. Analysis is all about asking questions. Who are you designing this game for? Think about demographic information. Not just what you might think might be in demographic information. Think about this from the scope of player types. What are the goals of the kinds of players who you are trying to speak to? What are their player interaction patterns, their desired player interaction patterns? So that kind of demographic information as well. Target platform, where do you want to release the game when it's done? Are you trying to create a mobile game, a desktop game, a console game? You're not designing this for yourself, you're designing it for some subset of population out there. So try to think from their perspective, to whatever extent you can. What are your resource limitations? How many people do you have at your disposal, or are you paying? What is your budget? What is your timeline? Time is the far and away the most important resource that you have, especially when you're designing a game, when I'm going to tell you something like you have 4 weeks to develop from conception to final product. 4 weeks. That's not very much time. Think about things like what prior art exists. What other games exist in this space? Are you creating a clone of another game? What can you learn from that game? You're competing against those games for people's time, attention, and money. So what are you doing that is different from that if you're just trying to create a clone? And then fastest path to a playable and testable game. How can we get this up and running and tested ASAP? We'll talk more about that when we talk about prototyping. But we'll come back to the rest of this tomorrow. Very quickly, we'll have a fun brainstorming task to do, and I have what I think is going to be a pretty fun class activity for us with regards to that. So we will meet for that tomorrow. I'll get the assignment up. Eventually. Hopefully very soon.
So. That's interesting.